Chapter 2, Lesson 2, Adding Integers. When we add integers with the same sign, it's pretty easy to do. Alright, so the first thing that we're going to do, our rules that we follow, is that we are going to add the absolute value of both numbers. Add the absolute value of the numbers. Alright, so who cares if they're positive or negative? We're just going to add the absolute value of them together. And then we are going to keep the same sign. So if they were both positive, we keep our answer positive. If they're both negative, we keep our answer negative. Alright, let's look at some examples. Alright, so for example, if I have 5 plus 2, obviously we know that, right? But I have a positive 5, positive 2, I'm adding them. I forget about their signs. Their absolute value is 5 and 2. We add them together and get 7. They're both positive. I keep my answer positive. Same thing if they're negatives, though, right? When I look at the 4, right, I forget about that it's a negative 4. I just say, okay, but the absolute value of it is 4. Forget that it's a negative 8. Absolute value of that is 8. So when I add 4 plus 8, I get 12. And then I say, oh, but they're both negative, so my answer is negative. Now, what happens if we add integers with different signs? This gets a little bit trickier, but I'm sure you remember how to do it. All right? This time, instead of adding their absolute values, we actually subtract their absolute values. Let's say subtract the absolute values of the numbers. And then how do we know which sign goes with it? We decide the sign comes from the number with the bigger absolute value. So we look at the two numbers, and whichever one has the bigger absolute value, the sign from that number stays with our answer. Let's look at some examples. For example, if I have 9 plus negative 4, first thing I'm going to do is forget about the signs, subtract their absolute values. So 9 minus 4 is 5. And then I'm going to say, okay, well, is it going to be positive or negative? Well, my 9 has a bigger absolute value than a negative 4. And since my 9 is positive, my answer stays positive. And then I'm going to look at negative 9 plus 4. Again, absolute values, 9 and 4, subtract them, and I get 5. And then I say, okay, absolute value of negative 9 is 9. Absolute value of 4 is 4. The bigger absolute value is in the negative 9. So my answer is going to be negative. All right, the last thing we're going to look at is the additive inverse property. So we're just going to get a few definitions in your notes. First thing we want to look at is what are opposites when we talk about numbers. Opposites are just the positive and negative numbers. It's the positive and negative numbers with the same absolute value. Right? So an example of opposites would be negative 5 and 5. Okay? A little bit different than reciprocals, but opposites are positive and negative in math. And then the additive inverse property. So our actual property then states that any number added with its opposite equals 0. All right, and you can put an example of that. So we could say that negative 8 plus positive 8 equals 0. And the way that I can use even my variables to show that would be like a plus negative a will always equal 0.